All right, so lesson 3 of the Ableton Live basic course. Today I want to talk to you about EQ and compression. These are two extremely essential things you need to know how to do, the different ways to use either of those two things. We're going to talk about mid-side and stereo EQ. We're going to talk about dynamic, parallel, and sidechain compression, and when and where to use each. Let's do it. Okay, so first things first, let's go over EQ and what EQ is. EQ is equalization, meaning the frequencies of a specific sound, or sound in a group, or sound in a bus, or whatever. So the EQ, the frequencies that you will be manipulating per sound. So to start, let's pull up an EQ. Pull up your favorite EQ that you have. I'll show you in Ableton stock EQ8 what each thing is, the different kinds of EQ, what mid-side and the difference between them is, mid-side and stereo, and hopefully after EQ you'll get a good idea of what that's doing, when to apply it. Then we'll go into compression. So let's start with EQ. So let's use Ableton's stock equalizer. Now there's an EQ8 and an EQ3. Let's use EQ8 because EQ8 shows you what shows you the different bands. EQ3 would just show you split the three bands into low, mid, or high. But EQ8, you can be more specific with the bands that you cut or boost, for that matter. So first things first, there's one concept that you should know, and that is subtractive EQ before compression, additive EQ after compression. So cut all the frequencies that you don't like out of a sound before you compress the sound, because if you compress a sound prior to EQ cutting it, say there's frequencies that you don't like, you're going to boost all these frequencies that you don't like, and that can muddy a mix extremely quickly. So subtractive EQ before compression, additive EQ after compression. To start with EQ, we're going to be looking at, let's just say, let's do this synth noise. So just as a refresher to what we were doing last time. There's your beat. Vibey. Cool. So this sound. There's a couple of these buzzy frequencies up here that I want to remove. So let's first go over the different kinds of EQs there is, and what you can do with that EQ, and then we'll go into actually using it in a practical way. So let's go with EQ8, and right here in the spectrum analyzer down here, you can see all the frequencies of the sound. So it shows you that you have some low frequencies into the lower mids, and then it kind of tapers off near the high, and that reflects with the sound that you hear. First kind of EQ, low cut or high pass. It is the exact same thing, and it's the same thing because, as you can see, it is cutting the lows and it is passing the highs. Although these in here would be recognized as the high frequencies somewhere in here, it is still passing high frequencies and cutting low frequencies. Fantastic, that's one. So on the flip side, you have high cut or low pass. So as you're seeing, it's cutting high frequencies, it is letting the low frequencies pass. You have bell curves, which is these little like a curved band that you see happening that you could use to either cut or boost frequencies. You have, let's do it on 8, you have a high shelf. As you can see, there's making a shelf. And on the contrary, this one here, you have a low shelf. So it's shelving all the low frequencies, or it's shelving all the high frequencies. Also, if you double click this EQ, it pulls out here. Now I don't really use EQ8 because I like to use something called FabFilter, which is a third-party plugin, which I am totally in love with. But that's a really cool feature that I didn't know that it did. So you can click on the spectrum analyzer and now you'll have a big view of it here. Great feature by Ableton. So let's just turn these off for now, or we'll just load up a new instance here for sake of speed. Now you can be extremely surgical with EQ cutting by narrowing the gain. So if there's just one tiny little frequency in there that you don't like, you can EQ sweep, is what they call it, for that frequency. As you can hear, it's sweeping. And then what you do is, you don't like that frequency, you turn it down. Just like so. Maybe little surgical notches here. Great. So that's the different kinds of bands that are in an EQ and what you can use and the kind of terminology behind them. Let's talk about mid-side and stereo EQ. Stereo EQ is everything in the middle and on the sides of the stereo field. That is everything that you hear inside your headphones or out of your monitor. So anything on the left or the right ear is going to be in stereo. Anything that's coming directly down the center is going to be in mono. Now, if you're working with sounds that are in mono and only in mono, then you can use the stereo, but it's only going to affect things in mono. If you want to just tailor things or cut or boost frequencies that are in the side information of the sound, you can switch this mode here from stereo to mid-side. So stereo, mid-side. So this mid-side is mono, stereo, mid-side. So if you want only the frequencies that are in the direct center, so say like a kick drum or like a bass, you want it in mono and you want to be able to manipulate the frequencies that are just coming down the very center of the stereo field. On the other side, if you're working with layered vocals or something like that, and you want your vocal doubles or anything backing up your vocal, but you don't want it to clash with the frequencies of your lead vocal, which is happening right down the middle, then you could flip your EQ into mid-side mode. Let's go back to it, into mid-side mode, and start cutting down just the frequencies that are going to clash with your lead vocal. So let's say, for example, so right now, because the M is highlighted, it's in mono or mid. If you click this button, you'll switch it to side. So it'll show you the two differences. So this is all the information in the side, this is all the information in the mid. So let's bring that back up. So as per our example, say it was a vocal, and there was a vocal double, and there was too much mid information of the double, and it was clouding the clarity of your lead vocal, you would just take this and figure out what frequencies are clashing the most, and you could just pull this down with a bell curve, and you would free up some space for your lead vocal. Cool. Basics of EQ. Let me show you what I use. Strongly recommend the FabFilter bundles. So this is what I use. It is the exact same as this frequencies, or as this spectrum here, right here. I just like the bigger screen. So, low cut or high pass, high cut or low pass, bell curves, high shelf, low shelf. I really like this one because just with my keys, just with my command key here on a Mac, I can kind of manipulate the band. And like we were saying in mid-side, FabFilter Pro Q3 has your different options right here. Now you can also go into right and left side specifically. So if you know that there's something happening on the left that is clashing with another one of the elements in your song that you moved over to the left side, you can just manipulate that. So leave that in stereo. That is the basics of EQ. Now, EQ is an essential tool that you need to know how to use as a music producer or as an engineer. You need to figure out what sounds clash with each other, what range of that sound, whether it's the low mids or the mids or the highs or whatever it is. You need to be able to distinguish what the problem area is and be able to manipulate it. Sometimes it can be very drastic. Other times it can be very, very minor, and it makes all the difference. So don't feel like you need to go overboard with it. I personally believe it should be done anywhere between -1 to -3 decibels, which would just be like this. Makes a huge difference. So don't feel like in every sound you got to chop it all the way down here, because you absolutely do not. A lot of the times you can ruin your mix by taking too much of the frequencies away from the sound. So let's use this in a practical way. Start with this hat. Take that off. Because I've showed you the difference, I'm going to go to my favorite, which is an EQ3. I'm going to low cut this hat. Now I know in my productions I fill them up with a lot of sounds, although there isn't right now. But if I low cut it like this, it means I'm getting rid of all of these frequencies that are happening down here, and they're almost too subtle in the context of a mix to even hear. So all it's going to do is clutter your mix and add too many variable frequencies happening where your other elements should be taking place. So if the bass line is happening in here and you have all of these random frequencies that are almost inaudible to your own ear, it's just gonna muddy your water, so to speak. It's gonna make your mix muddy. So I know I'm gonna roll this maybe to about 400 hertz. We may even go higher as I start adding new sounds and I start adding top loops and like shakers and things like that. They might start taking up, and tambourines, they may start taking up some of this frequency range. So if that's the case, I may not need any of that. I may want just a really light kind of hat that's gonna happen just like this. So if I low cut it up here and band it, and high shelf it, and just make a really light hat. I tend to like it a lot softer, especially for deep house music. Softer I can get it, the better, while still being, very present. So that might be a practical approach to EQing a hat. Now you'll notice it's the very first thing that I've done, because if I want to go into compress it afterwards so it's more present in the mix, I want to make sure that I'm not compressing these and making these louder. You just don't want that. So let's take that out. Cool. So there's one approach to using a EQ. Great. I want to move into compression. Because this is a basic course, we could talk all day about EQ, how to use it, when to use it, put it on every one of these sounds and show you what I do, but let's just keep this quite simple. Cool. EQ, one thing. Let's move into compression. EQ, subtractive EQ before compression. I have done the subtraction. Great. For this hat, I might want it to be, I might want to change the dynamics of the hat and how quick it goes up to its high, the loudest point, and how long it takes for it to come down. So I'm going to use another Fab Filter program called Pro C. So the basics of compression are going to be the exact same. I'm an attack, a release, a threshold, and the ratio in which it is being compressed. So as you notice, if I turn this off, here. So there's the sound with the subtractive EQ. It is before it in the chain. Turn it on. This is a stock. When you load up Pro Q2, this is what it looks like. So up the threshold. If it's a shorter attack, it's going to feel a lot punchier and snappier, as you hear. Short attack, short release makes it a lot snappier. If you increase the release, kind of draws it out a little bit longer. If you increase the attack, kind of takes longer to get to that snap. Now, when you are compressing a sound to change its dynamics, which is what we're doing here with this compressor, there is a point in your compression where the sound feels like it's breathing with the track. You can almost feel the groove that it's creating, and there is a sweet spot, and you will be able to find it if you play with it long enough. So if you increase the ratio, it's a ratio of how much it's being compressed, and you can tell by these peaks up here. Turn the threshold down, it's going to be compressed more. I'm not going to get into knee, range, hold, or look ahead. I'll just leave it like that. So that's an example of dynamic compression. I want to talk about a different kind of compression as well, which is parallel compression. This is by no means a beginner concept, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because it is a kind of compression that you need to be able to think about. When I figured out how to do parallel processing, it upped my game substantially. So I think the quicker you can grasp this concept and what it's doing to your signal chain and what it's doing to your sound, the better you're going to do. So let's figure out what parallel compression is. So let's just turn this off once again. Let's just get rid of that. We're going to throw another Pro C2 in. So I've basically taken off whatever I did with that other one. Let's mute that. I'm going to put this into a chain, or into a group, an instrument rack, I should say. Pardon me. I'm going to put that into an audio effect rack. So here you go. If I hit Command G, let's undo that just so I do this properly. Here's the sound. I threw it into Ableton, into your signal chain. You have your subtractive EQ, and now you threw in a compressor. If I hit Command G or Control C or Control G on a Mac, it puts it into an audio effect rack. So now the signal chain is going like this. It's going from the hat, which is in your drum rack, through all the processing that I didn't do in here, into a subtractive EQ, into just the compressor, and then coming out through to the master. Now, parallel compressions meanings I'm going to compress the sound in its own signal chain. So if I just do this and create a new chain, now I have two. Now I have your hi-hat, which is in the drum rack with the processing that I did not do, into the subtractive EQ, into the compressor on its default settings, into the master. As well though, it's the hi-hat in the drum rack, into a subtractive EQ, into a dry signal chain. There is nothing on it. So now they are both in the signal chain, two of the same sound coming through at once. This is great if you want to do different things to the sound, like you want to layer in a distortion plugin and you just want to be able to automate the volume so it's and EQ that specifically. We're talking about compression right now. So let's say that I really enjoyed what I already did in the processing over here, again, which I did not do. And I already love what's happening, but I just want to add some more snap, some more just snap to the hat. Well, what you would do is you would come into your parallel processing compressor, or your parallel processing that you did here under your compression. So let's just, for sake of ease, call that compressor and relabel this to parallel comp for compressor, and we'll call this the dry signal. So let's say I want to make it really, really snappy. What you want to do is you just want to go into your chain. So I'm in the compressor here, and I'm just going to make a short attack, short release. now it's just making it snappier. So what you would do at this point is you would just lower the volume on your parallel processing signal chain so that you're mixing the two sounds together. So if I just go over here into the volume of that compressor itself, and I just go down on my arrow keys until it just kind of fits in nicely, just to add that snap that I wanted. It's just gonna be all that much snappier. So if I bypass it using this or turn it off, click so there was your dry with the subtractive EQ and whatever processing that I did not do over here. There's your dry sound. Now you layer in the parallel compressor and it's just all that much snappier. Now you could do anything you want after this to the dry signal or to the compressor because you've split it. Something I didn't mention that we should talk about is a glue compressor. So if you have a sound that has a lot of these parallel elements to it, you're gonna need something at the end, a compressor that kind of glues it together so the dynamics all are working the same way. So you could use Ableton's glue compressor, which is right here. So say this was at the end of your signal chain. Short attack, short release, because you're not trying to change the dynamics, you're just trying to make sure that they're all kind of operating the same way. And then you would just bring down the threshold, just to kiss the needle. It's right here, just so it's moving ever so slightly. And if it was too low after that, you can bring up your makeup gain. So let's just hear what that did if I turn the dry wet to 0. You can't really tell it's two sounds, but this makes sure that it sounds like one sound. Cool. So that was a dynamic compressor, a parallel compressor, and a glue compressor. The last thing I want to talk about is a sidechain compressor. Sidechain compressor is great to do in house music to create this kind of bounce element. So if we're talking about this sound right here, just one piano, a couple piano chords. Well, what we want to do is we want to make sure that it, not make sure, but we want to make it duck every time the kick hits. So you're kind of creating this kind of rhythmic bounce to it, and I'll show you what I mean. So let's go into Ableton's compressor. We'll just use Ableton for the purpose of this one. If you have the ability to get LFO Tool by Steve Duda, I highly recommend it because it is a fantastic plugin. But for this, we'll just use Ableton's compressor. My kick is up here. We want to make sure that this compressor triggers every time this kick hits. And we're going to do that by hitting this arrow, go to sidechain, audio from wherever you have your kick. So I believe if I look again, I'm on kick 2. So let's make that kick 2. I was already doing something very subtly, but I want to drastically do it so you hear exactly what it's doing. So let's turn this up a little bit. Let's turn my hats down a little bit. Probably also going to turn everything down. Let's turn it down 3 decibels. Noticing it's not distorting the sound by any means, but I'm trying to micromanage the mix all at the same time. So I pulled everything down a healthy 3 decibels, so down negative 3 decibels, just so I'm not overpassing the 0 line. So now we've set this. Let's try to do something very, very drastic so you hear exactly what it's doing to the sound. So you're listening to this, and you want to hear it bounce. So I'll solo in the kick, holding command and clicking the solo button. So now I just have the piano and the kick. So now you hear it almost ducking every single time the kick hits. They can change the attack and release, so it happens quicker. Or up the release, so it takes longer to come back. And the ratio, it's ducking deeper, so to speak. Your knee will make it softer or harder. Smoother or rougher. And your look ahead is how long before or after the sound it takes to trigger. If we lower the dry wet, it's the amount of signal going through this compressor. So at 32%, you have more of the dry signal coming through and not being affected by the sidechain compressor. At 78%, you have more of that sidechain happening. Now, if I was making a house track and I wanted a lot of movement to it and a lot of energy, I would probably be putting a sidechain compressor on a lot of my hat elements, a lot of my drum elements, I should say, a lot of the percussions, the hats. It would definitely go on the bass, all at varying dry wets. Dry wet meaning off on, or the signal that's passing through it. And you really create these grooves, and at the same time, you're allowing your kick, which is a very fundamental part of this music, to get through the mix, to cut through the mix, and that is extremely, extremely important. A troublesome area for me, at least when starting out, was, why was my kick always, it didn't feel that present, it didn't feel like it was there. I could have all the sounds in the world, but my kick was always hurting. And that's a very important part of your mix. It keeps the rhythm in house music. It's just important. So sidechain compression was something that really upped my skill level and the clarity of my mixes. So just as a recap, we talked about EQing, the different kinds of bands in EQing and what you can do with it. We talked about compression, dynamic, parallel, glue, and sidechain. And I think just as an added bonus, I will just try to reiterate what I talked about at the beginning, which was subtractive EQ before compression, additive EQ after compression. So just as an example, let's come back to this hat that we're working with. Great, with the glue on it. Now this would be probably last in my signal chain unless there was a limiter, depending on the sound afterwards. We're not talking about limiters right now, but what I did say was subtractive EQ before compression, additive EQ after compression. So let's say my mix was filled up at this point, but there was no sparkle to my hats. Like my high part of my mix just was lacking. It didn't do anything for me. Well, what you would do is you could just use that same EQ again, and let's just say we would use a high shelf. So let's use the Ableton Eq8. So we'll go after compression. I'm not cutting this one, all I'm doing is adding. So let's put it into, we'll leave it in stereo. Let's just say I want to do, let's do it with 8, and we'll do it like this. Opposite. Let's turn it off. It's relatively dull. And yes, I really haven't done anything to it. But now you just added that sparkle just in the top. Anyway, that's been a recap of EQ and compression. For beginners, I realize some of it may be a little bit hard to understand, but I promise you, if you can grasp the concept of parallel processing and you can ingrain in your head subtractive EQ before compression, additive EQ after compression, your mixes will thank you, and you'll get to where you want to be faster. I made a lot of these mistakes as a self-taught engineer and music producer in the beginning. I refused to watch tutorial videos, and I learned a lot of interesting ways to do these things, but it did take me a lot longer to figure out why the elements in my mix weren't working the way they should. I learned a lot of creative ways to do things, but you know, it also somewhat hurt me in the long run. I wasn't in a rush, didn't matter to me, so hey. That being said, a lot of these concepts I struggled with for a long time, and if you can figure out how to kind of nip those before you make those same mistakes for years on end before somebody points it out to you, that's, you know, all I'm sitting here trying to help you with. Anyway, this is Warren at Generation Media Group, and we'll see you on episode 4 of Ableton Beginner Basic course. Cheers.